the 80-20 rule and some misconceptions about it, and maybe a little bit of how it applies to our Qigong practice and our day-to-day lives. That's going to be the topic of this episode of Qi Life. Alright, so I'm guessing most, if not all of you, have probably heard of the 80-20 rule. It's a pretty common maxim that people use to describe how things work in the world. And it seems to hold pretty true. It seems to apply pretty well. And basically it says that on average, there will be some variation. We tend to get 80% of our results from the thing that we put 20% of our effort into. Yeah, and that means that we're only getting about 20% of our results from the things that we put 80% of our effort into. It's an interesting thing, and it does seem to be true. Like in terms of business, for example, this is a good one where it's commonly applied, where maybe a business actually makes 80% of their profit from 20% of their customers. And then the rest of their customers, all of the 80%, they're only making 20% of their profit from that. And it applies to lots of other areas of life as well that we put our effort into and where we get our results from. Now, that's a really useful thing to be aware of. I think sometimes people misinterpret what that means though, because there can be a tendency to think that like, okay, so I get 80% of my results from the things that I just put 20% of my time, my effort into. Maybe I should just do that then, and I won't do the other 80%, I'll only do that 20%. I think this is a common misconception, because the dynamics of things are in our lives that, yes, maybe we're getting, so much of our results from that 20%, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to do the 80%. Often, actually, in order to effectively do that 20% and get the benefit from it, that 80% actually played a role in supporting that. And we actually had to do the 80% in order to get, that bit that really yielded the results. And yeah, so I think that's a helpful thing to understand, because there can be a tendency to, if we think just 80-20 and like we're just going to focus on that one thing, that we actually find that if we do that, that we become unbalanced. Yeah, and that 80% was actually more necessary than we thought. It was just a little bit invisible. Back to that example of like a business one where you get 80% of your profits from 20% of your customers, and that means the rest of the 80% is only giving you 20. The rest of the 80% is only giving you 20%. Well, often part of providing a good service, providing a good product, means that you actually have to cater to that whole audience, right, in order to do that. And you don't actually know who's going to end up in the 20%. Like over time, it might become clear who's in that 20%. But it's part of creating a whole ecosystem where you actually need to provide services to all of them as well. So let's see. Moving this into our Qigong practice. When we think about our Qigong practice or other aspects of our lives, we can think that, or we can become aware that actually we get huge results in terms of what goes on within our energy, with our health and so on, from things that are often relatively simple, from things like our breathing, doing breath work, different breathing exercises, and this makes a massive difference to us. We might find also that maybe some meditation, we go, wow, get really good results from a particular meditation. Or different things like that. And so we can, you could, if you misunderstood this principle, then think like, oh, okay, well, I get so much result from that, all I'm going to do is breathwork and meditation. But actually, to get the value from that breathwork and meditation, you have to take care of everything else. You have to do physical exercise, get your body moving. You have to eat well, you have to sleep well, you probably need to maybe work at a job that earns you money, all of these different things that then support you in being able to get the value out of that 20%. So understanding that 80% of the results comes from that 20% doesn't mean we then put all of our focus on it. It means that, but what it does mean, I think, is, or what is important from understanding this, is to make sure that we don't neglect that 20%, that we appreciate how valuable that is, and we maybe prioritize it. We don't put our whole focus on it. Doesn't mean that we neglect the 80%, but we prioritize. We make absolutely sure that we are doing that 20%, because that's where we know we really get the results from. Whereas if we do neglect something, if we don't quite have time to fit everything in, maybe it's part of the 80% that we don't fit in, because sometimes in life we're busy, right? Doesn't mean that we neglect it totally, but sometimes, okay, if there's something that we need to miss, maybe we'll miss some of the 80%, but we make sure we don't neglect that 20%. We put sufficient focus on it, recognizing that it is just part of a greater whole. The peak of a wave is often the exciting bit, where the action happens. Like if you're a surfer, you're riding a wave, it's like, yeah, that peak, it breaking, right? But underneath that, there's all the rest of the swell that's supporting it. You don't get the peak of the wave without the rest of the swell supporting it. And so we need to look at things holistically, understand their different roles, their different parts, put our focus where it's most valuable, certainly, but understand also that some of the things that don't seem as spectacularly important are still playing their role. Some of the stuff that seems mundane, seems sometimes not so important, often does have an importance, and we're only going to find that out, and hopefully we don't find that out, if we then neglect that, and then we realize, like, hey, actually part of that 80% was supporting the 20%, because everything falls over. So, everything does have its role. Yeah. Anyway, hopefully that's interesting, maybe something useful from that one. I look forward to seeing you on another one soon.